Wake up, Dr. Ehrman. The Matrix has you.
Let me give you one piece of advice. Be honest. He knows more than you can imagine.
At last. Welcome, Dr. Ehrman. As you no doubt have gathered, I am Jonathan Sheffield, the Autodidact.
It's an honor to meet you.
No, the honor is mine. Please sit. We have many things to discuss. In my recent animated video productions, I have challenged the theories of Dr. Ehrman by demonstrating how we got the books of the Bible, chronicling the ecclesiastical polity set up by the apostolic churches, used to transmit and safeguard the text of the New Testament down through the ages. On July 30th, 2017, Dr. Ehrman has heeded my call and summoned me to a debate on his blog. Let us now begin. Dr. Ehrman, I imagine right now you must be feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole, not knowing where you'll go or how you'll ever return.
I don't understand. Why exactly am I here?
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know, you can't explain, but you feel it. You've felt it since you began. That there's something wrong with your theories. You don't know what it is, but it's there. Like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Let us be honest, Dr. Ehrman. You're a slave to these textual theories, which has created this imaginary world of yours, a delusion of sorts that has pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
I don't understand. What truth could you possibly be referring to?
Dr. Ehrman, are you ready to believe and accept how we got the text of the New Testament that was commonly received by the apostolic churches? For this is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. You keep your prestige, your books, and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how far the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. The following production will recreate the de facto debate between Dr. Bart Ehrman and myself, Jonathan Sheffield, that commenced on the Bart Ehrman Blog during the period of July 30th through October 29th, 2017. To be fair to Dr. Ehrman, we will only communicate his actual responses as he stated it on his blog, and will not deviate from our questions and responses to Dr. Ehrman. To set the stage for this discourse with Dr. Ehrman, I have prepared opening remarks to help explain to our viewers the major issues in this debate. Your Honour, Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have summoned Dr. Ehrman here today to dispose him on two major conspiracy theories that he has popularized in such titles as Misquoting Jesus and Forged, concerning the texts of the New Testament which assert that the biblical structures commonly received by the apostolic churches are corrupt. Now, the first conspiracy theory propagated by Dr. Ehrman is that the New Testament gospel publications of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by the disciples of Jesus. For in Dr. Ehrman's world, which he has created for us, he tells us, "We don't know who wrote them. All we know is they certainly weren't the followers of Jesus who spoke Aramaic, and were lower-class peasants without an education. These books are written by highly educated Greeks, probably living outside Palestine 40 or 50 years later." Members of the jury, the problem with Dr. Ehrman's narrative is it doesn't explain how the independent Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic apostolic churches throughout the Mediterranean basically came up with the same 4 books, naming the same authors, unless it does go back to the apostles as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and the apostolic churches said it did. Did you notice that Dr. Ehrman couldn't identify by name who these well-educated Greeks were, or where they are from? He also doesn't explain why well-educated Greeks would write in Koine with smatterings of Aramaic instead of Attic or Alexandrian Greek. That's odd. Or, how does Dr. Ehrman explain that the overwhelming majority of apostolic churches independently testify to these same 4 books, naming the same authors, while the biblical texts of the Gnostics all differed amongst themselves? In any other court of law, this testimony would be conclusive. But the conspiracies don't stop there, oh no. There are more. For Dr. Ehrman also tells us on the front cover of his book, Misquoting Jesus, that this publication is the story behind who changed the Bible and why. That's right. The New Testament scriptures that have come down to us today are not the same New Testament scriptures that were originally received by the official apostolic churches. And to be clear, the changes Dr. Ehrman is speaking of are not spelling errors, copyist slips, word line omissions, or variants. But Dr. Ehrman is referring to a new evolution of the New Testament, where some of our favorite readings, which include the woman accused of adultery, the last 12 verses of Mark, the doxology, and many others, were conflated into the text over a period of time. And to be fair to Dr. Ehrman, this view is not his own to bear, but is shared among many evangelical New Testament textual critics, to include Mr. James White, who has been hiding out from us since our publication of our 3rd video, and the Mr. Daniel Wallace, who has yet to answer our challenge, since he has probably been preoccupied trying on his new so-called 1st century mask of Mark's Gospel. But in all seriousness, how did such a major change to the text of the New Testament infiltrate the thousands of texts of the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic apostolic churches in the ancient world, which basically witness to these same consistent readings? Now, during our deposition with Dr. Ehrman, he shared a little secret with me on October 29th, 2017. He stated, scribes changed their texts, sometimes massively, and those changes were often copied by later scribes to become the standard text of the late Middle Ages. Now, Dr. Ehrman's statements naturally beg the following questions. Who were the scribes? Where were they from? And how were they able to make these massive changes to the scriptures throughout the ancient world without anyone ever noticing? During today's proceedings, Dr. Ehrman isn't going to be able to answer any of these questions, let alone demonstrate how such a change could have taken place in the ancient world without anyone ever noticing. So please pay attention, as Dr. Ehrman tries to dodge my questions. We are going to test Dr. Ehrman's hypothesis against a specific text which was preached on at Antioch in 385 AD by John Chrysostom. I wanted to test his theory against this text, instead of trying to explain all the texts of the Greek apostolic churches, because Antioch is the oldest surviving apostolic Greek church, and this is basically the first time in history we can begin to see the official text at Antioch being publicly read to the congregations by a member of the church. Remember, Christianity has just recently become legal, and the Arians have recently been defeated. So, the natural assumption is that this text would be basically the same text, barring copyist mistakes and scribal variations, that was received and read by Ignatius of Antioch in 85 AD. In addition, Chrysostom's text basically witnesses to the same type of text that has come down through the apostolic Greek churches that we have today. This is why, when these theories were first introduced by Hort, Griesbach, and Hug in the 19th century, Chrysostom's text came under attack. For Ehrman's and evangelical scholars' theories all fall apart on this one text. This is the reason why evangelical scholar Dr. Gordon Fee made the following statement regarding Chrysostom's text, when he says, Chrysostom's text is still closer to the majority text than it is to any text of the 2nd or 3rd century. Dr. Fee was no dummy either, because he had to show that Chrysostom's text was different than the text of earlier generations, because he understood the implications to his theories otherwise. We now begin with our opening question to Dr. Ehrman. I don't understand how Chrysostom in 385 AD could have preached from a revised text at Antioch, whose homilies were copied in shorthand and are still read to this day in the Greek Orthodox world, and no one noticed it was a revised text until Anthony Hort in 1881. Yet, everyone noticed instantly that the RV was a different text, and they didn't have to wait over 1400 years to realize it. E.g., Jerome changed one word in Jonah, and the churches of North Africa rioted. Irenaeus and Tertullian instantly recognized that Marcion was using a different text from the apostolic churches. So this is the first question I pose to you, Dr. Ehrman. Now the last 12 verses of Mark and the woman in adultery are prime examples which are the subset of the larger issue I posed above. Who created these passages? Where was it created? Who were the scribes? And what was the process that basically got this passage into the majority of independent Greek, Latin, and some Aramaic apostolic texts throughout the Mediterranean world, without anyone ever noticing? So basically, who were the ones doing it?
It sounds like you're imagining that scholars say that there was a single textual tradition throughout Christendom until the time of Chrysostom, and that a revision of the text took place in Antioch, as evidenced in Chrysostom's writings. Is that what you have in mind, and that you're objecting to as being thoroughly implausible? If so, the problem would be that there are not any textual critics who have that view. Although I suppose supporters of the Textus Receptus might claim that this is the view they are attacking. There is a massive scholarly literature on the early history of the text and the formation of the Byzantine majority text. If you want some bibliography, I'm happy to give it.
Dr. Ehrman. Well, I know about the so-called Alexandrian, Caesarean, Western Byzantium text-type theories. I also know about the so-called Lucan, conflation, process, standardization, and other theories. But what I am asking is, did any church father say that the text of Chrysostom was corrupt? This is what I was asking in my original question I posed to you. So, to help clarify what I was asking, did any church father say that the specific text of Chrysostom which he preached at Antioch was corrupt? All I am asking is about that one specific text, not the Byzantium.
Church fathers often did talk about corruptions of the text, but apart from Marcion, I don't know of any church father commenting on the particular text used by one of his opponents. An interesting case is Origen's opposition to the Valentinian Heracleon, who had written a commentary on the fourth gospel. Origen objects strenuously to Heracleon's interpretation, point by point, but he doesn't appear to realize that one reason Heracleon had a different interpretation of the text was that he was actually using a different text. I demonstrated that some years ago in a couple of technical articles I published. I can give you the references if you'd like. Moreover, To my knowledge, we don't have a record of any church father from the period commenting on the sermons of another church father. That is, about anything the person said or quoted in his sermon. So that we couldn't have fathers objecting to Chrysostom's quotations of Scripture. Do you happen to know of any?
Dr. Ehrman. Now, I totally agree with your statement that the Church Fathers were well aware of variants in the texts. Both Irenaeus and Tertullian in the 2nd century noticed a major difference between Marcion's shorter text of Luke and 10 letters of Paul in comparison to the texts read in the apostolic churches throughout the Mediterranean world. You also bring up an excellent point in the case of Origen, because even though Origen could not equate that the variance in the interpretation stemmed from a different text, he still did recognize that something was different. Now, getting back to my original question, I asked if any church father that the specific text at Antioch publicly read to the congregations that John Chrysostom preached on was corrupt, different, revised, or whatever you want to call it. I do want to be clear that it wasn't so much about his sermons, but because his comments were so extensive in his sermons, we are able to see the type of text that was being publicly read to the congregations at Antioch in the 4th century. The significance of Chrysostom's homilies is that they were read throughout the Greek Orthodox churches, even to this day. We know from Chrysostom's writings that people came to hear him preach, bringing their shorthand instruments to record his sermons. Yet, as you alluded to, and I am also aware, we have no comment from any Greek, Latin, or Aramaic church father that attacked his text. It took over 1400 years for the likes of Professor Hug, Griesbach, and Hort to be the first to criticize Chrysostom's text as corrupt. Almost the same set of circumstances is exemplified in Jerome's Vulgate, yet something different was noticed that caused alarm. His translation of Jonah was publicly read in the Church of North Africa, and the translation of one word from gourd to ivy that the congregation heard being read resulted in a riot as reported by Augustine, who personally wrote letters to Jerome that were sent through the churches, which communicated Augustine's concerns with his revision. Now, when the RV came in 1881, instantly everyone noticed that a shorter text was introduced, just as the apostolic churches noted that Marcion introduced a shorter text in the 2nd century. While the differences in the text of Marcion, Jerome, and the RV were quickly noticed and attacked, we have no historical record that the congregations and bishops throughout the Greek Orthodox world criticized the text that Chrysostom's homilies revealed. So, Dr. Ehrman, here is the dilemma we are facing. If we reject the position of the apostolic churches as explained by Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others on the commonly received texts, then we have to explain when the text of Chrysostom was created, where it was created, by whom it was created, and how it was put into the thousands of independent apostolic Greek churches, without anyone apparently noticing it, as they did with the text of Marcion, the Vulgate, and the RV. These were historical times, Dr. Ehrman, and well documented. We have records of the councils, synods, we know all of the fights, and the bishops that presided over the apostolic sees, going all the way back. Now, according to Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the best, which would be the explanation of Irenaeus, Tertullian, and the other apostolic churches.
My point is that we don't have any record of any church father ever saying anything about the corrupt text of the New Testament that any other church father was citing. So why would we expect it in the case of Chrysostom? Do you know of any such discussion in any writings of the church fathers? It sounds like you're implying that the text attested by Chrysostom must have been the same text attested by the earlier Christian writers. What came to be known as the Byzantine text was decidedly not attested by earlier writers than Chrysostom. That has been shown time and time again by every analysis of the early fathers' writings. If you're not familiar with the studies, I'd suggest you read the volumes in the SBL series, The New Testament in the Greek Fathers, starting with my study of Didymus the Blind.
I will address the questions you have asked me in your last response momentarily, but I have been patiently waiting for you to first document when this so-called creation of Chrysostom's text occurred. Can you provide me with dates, times, and a location for when this project kicked off? Can you at least provide me a list, including the names of bishops, scribes, and/or key figures associated with the apostolic Greek churches that were involved in this so-called creation? Was a council or synod convened? Or was it a band of rogue scribes that infiltrated the text at Antioch and forced the bishop of that period to comply with the new text? Because if such an event did occur, it is not unreasonable to assume this information would be available. For I can document this type of information in regards to Jerome's Old and New Testament translation project. Additional information is available regarding Thomas of Harkel's translation of the Greek into Aramaic and Lucan's editing of the Septuagint. As I have already stated, the historical archives are silent to what you are suggesting. But what is even stranger is that no one noticed that such an event took place until 1400 years after the fact, when Griesbach, Hug, and Hort first introduced the idea that the text of Chrysostom was corrupt. Now, Dr. Ehrman, I was under the assumption that we both came to the conclusion that the apostolic churches, to include the bishops, writers, and congregations, were well aware of such changes to the texts of the Old and New Testaments. I do want to remind you that both Irenaeus and Tertullian noticed and challenged Marcion's shorter text of Luke and 10 letters of Paul in the 2nd century. Let's not forget that Gaius, an Orthodox father from Rome, who wrote near the end of the 2nd century, named 4 heretics who not only altered the text, but had disciples who multiplied copies of their efforts. I do need your help to understand, Dr. Ehrman, why I have such a problem with a so-called creation of Chrysostom's text being introduced into Antioch, and no one had a clue that the text was changed. Which leads us back to your early assertion that we don't have any record of any church father ever saying anything about the corrupt text of the New Testament that any other church father was citing. And then you follow up by asking, why would we expect it in the case of Chrysostom? Well, Dr. Ehrman, I want to present to you Augustine's letter to Jerome, written in AD 403, where he responds to Jerome giving him feedback on both his translation of the Old Testament book of Jonah, as well as his gospel translations from the original Greek. In addressing his concerns with the book of Jonah, Augustine states, "A certain bishop, one of our brethren, having introduced in the church over which he presides the reading of your version, came upon a word in the book of the prophet Jonah, of which you have given a very different rendering from that which had been of the old familiar to the senses and memory of all the worshippers, and had been chanted for so many generations in the church." Dr. Ehrman, do you hear those words, that the worshippers had been accustomed to hearing that word gored in Jonah for so many generations in the church? They even committed it to memory. For Augustine continues his letter to demonstrate the severity that change had upon the congregations who heard it, stating, "Thereupon arose such a tumult in the congregation, especially among the Greeks, correcting what had been read and denouncing the translation as false." Help me understand why the Greek congregations at Antioch would not respond in a similar fashion when this so-called created text of Chrysostom was introduced. Now, the event in North Africa was based on one word. Can you imagine the reaction from the Greeks who heard a new so-called conflation being read at Antioch? Now, further on in Augustine's letter, he takes occasion to comment on Jerome's Gospels translation. Dr. Ehrman, pay attention, because this part is critical and addresses your earlier question. Augustine states, "At the same time, we are in no small measure thankful to God for the work in which you have translated the Gospels from the original Greek. because in almost every passage we have found nothing to object to when we compared it with the Greek scriptures. This testimony is striking because it demonstrates they were checking up on Jerome's gospel translation, comparing it against the Greek scriptures to make sure no funny business was going on. Note, Augustine states he found nothing to object to after he compared it against the Greek texts he had access to. This empirical evidence goes against your previous assertion, Dr. Ehrman. The fathers of the church did keep tabs on what was going on in regards to both the New Testament and the Old, and the congregations weren't idiots either. Furthermore, Dr. Ehrman, when you state what came to be known as the Byzantine text was decidedly not attested by earlier writers than Chrysostom, that has been shown time and again by every analysis of the early fathers' writings. It seems, Dr. Ehrman, that you have overlooked Edward Miller's study, who showed that portions of scripture distinctive to the received text were quoted extensively by notable church leaders as early as the 2nd century and onward. Kenyon says the following about Miller's research. The results of his examination are stated by him as follows. Taking the Greek and Latin, not the Syriac, fathers who died before AD 400, their quotations are found to support the TR in 2,630 instances, that is, the distinctive TR readings, the WH text in 1753. Nor is this majority due solely to the writers who belong to the end of this period. On the contrary, only the earliest writers be taken, from Clement of Rome to Irenaeus and Hippolytus, AD 97 to 236. The majority in favour of the TR is proportionately even greater, 151 to 84. I guess you must have forgotten about this study. Dr. Ehrman, regarding your study on Didymus the Blind, it is interesting in this age of postmodernism that I find another study of the text of Didymus, where this study concluded the text was 80% Byzantium in this sector. So much for the studies.
My book was published in the mid-1980s, and to my knowledge, no one has challenged its data or conclusions. It has served as a model for the kinds of studies done in the 30 years since. I was picking up on the approaches developed first by Ernst Colwell and then by Gordon Fee. Anyone who is seriously interested in the matter, I really can't think of a refutation to it, try as I might. The kind of simple statistic analysis of this other study you mention, who wrote it, by the way, and when? It isn't really adequate, for reasons I explain in my book. I look at every single quotation from all 4 Gospels and every surviving writing of Didymus and collate them against 20 representatives of all the leading textual groups, and then do several kinds of statistical analyses of the resultant data. Look and see. If you have objections to the method, I'd love to know. And if you approve the method, you'll have to approve the result. It sounds like the view you are objecting to is one that maintains that there was a single textual tradition widespread in the Christian tradition of the first 4, which was then altered by recension in Antioch, to which Chrysostom is a witness. Is that it? I don't know anyone who has that view. It really hasn't been around since I'm not sure when. Some 19th century scholars held it, kind of, but no one does today. If you want to see a more authoritative current view about the gradual emergence of the Byzantine text, I'd suggest Klaus Wachtel's impressive study Der byzantinische Text der katholischen Briefe, eine Untersuchung zur Entstehung der Koine des Neuen Testaments, Arbeiten zur neutestamentlichen Textforschung. If you don't do German, you can find it in any number of modern English discussions of textual criticism.
You seem to be saying that once upon a time, before Chrysostom preached at Antioch in 385 AD, somewhere in an unknown place by unknown scribes, Chrysostom's text was created, and was then somehow introduced into the Church of Antioch by unknown people. that was not noticed for almost 1400 years after the fact. I guess I lack faith here, because I find it really hard to believe. Yet, you lay before the Church of Antioch the charge of changing their text. Do you not afford the presumption of innocence to the Greek Orthodox Church at Antioch before being proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt as you would any other accused? This is why I documented the case of Marcion, to demonstrate that both Irenaeus and Tertullian noticed that a shorter text of Luke and 10 letters of Paul were introduced that was different than the texts of the apostolic churches. Do you notice, Dr. Ehrman, that we were able to document Marcion to establish the who, and then the what, which would be the introduction of the shorter biblical text? We can also establish the when, around 140 AD, and the where in Rome, and then the why he did it, which as Tertullian documents in his work against Marcion, is that Marcion claimed that the texts of the apostolic churches were interpolated by the defenders of Judaism, which is the reason he removed the Jewish readings from Paul's writings. Yet, Dr. Ehrman, you have not documented who were the people involved in the so-called creation of this specific text that was introduced at Antioch, not to mention the when and where this supposedly took place, and the why these unknown people felt a need to create a different Greek text to be used at Antioch. I also submitted to you Gaius' testimony, who was at Rome writing at the end of the 2nd century, who named 4 heretics who not only altered the biblical texts, but whose disciples also mutilated copies of their efforts. This was to demonstrate on a second occasion that another church father noticed a change in the biblical texts. But do you notice, Dr. Ehrman, how Gaius was able to name the people involved in the altering of the text? Yet I am still waiting for you to provide this information. I also documented that the historical archives are not silent to the creation of biblical texts, for we can document the creation of Jerome's Old and New Testament translation in the 4th century. We are also aware of Lucan's edition of the Septuagint, Thomas of Harkel's Aramaic translation in which he used a Greek text from Alexandria, Marab's translation into the Armenian, and the Gothic version that was done by Ulfilas. Do you see what text is not mentioned in this list? It's the so-called created text that you say was used at Antioch. In light of the testimony and documentation above, Dr. Ehrman, do you see how silly it sounds to assert that a so-called creation of a specific text that was used and preached on at Antioch by one of the most famous preachers, Chrysostom, who is still read throughout the Greek Orthodox world, yet no one noticed that it was a different text until 1400 years after the fact by Hort, Griesbach, and Hug, who weren't even Greek Orthodox? We have already demonstrated that the fathers of the church did recognize changes to the biblical texts as far back as the 2nd century and up to the 4th century. Dr. Ehrman, your only retort was to assert that we don't have any record of any church father ever saying anything about the corrupt text of the New Testament that any other church father was citing. So why would we expect it in the case of Chrysostom? Dr. Ehrman, we already established that Irenaeus and Tertullian criticized Marcion's shorter text. He was the son of a bishop from Pontus, and a member of the Church of Rome before he was excommunicated. Go figure. And also Gaius, another Orthodox father who named 4 heretics who were also altering the biblical text. Then I submitted Augustine's letter to Jerome, where he stated that when the rendering of one word was changed in Jerome's translation and was read before a congregation in North Africa from the Book of Jonah, it resulted in a riot, and that the Greeks in the congregation was especially upset and declared the translation to be false. This change of the text did not even escape the eyes of the bishop, who was reading from it. Are you suggesting that Greek worshippers or the bishop at Antioch wouldn't react in the same manner when a new, so-called Greek text was created? Augustine showed that the worshippers had heard this reading chanted for so many years, which was based on the Septuagint, Greek. Jerome based his translation on the Hebrew. It rendered a different translation, which sparked the outcry from the Greeks. I notice in your last response, Dr. Ehrman, you did not engage Augustine's letter to Jerome, or the other empirical data I listed as testimony. Another key point from that letter is Augustine stated that he and others vetted Jerome's Gospel translation, almost every passage, against the original Greek and found nothing to object to. We have the documentation from Jerome, where he criticized Lucan's editing of the Septuagint, because Jerome felt he should have done it from the Hebrew.
Augustine also cautioned Jerome against removing the Apocrypha from his Old Testament translation, because the worshippers, who were accustomed to these texts, would notice the change and react to it. This empirical data goes directly against your assertion, Dr. Ehrman. In addition, Dr. Ehrman, when you stated what came to be known as the Byzantine text was decidedly not attested by earlier writers than Chrysostom, that has been shown repeatedly by massive and irrefutable scholarship, I'm afraid. Once again, it appears you're excluding scholars and studies outside of your school of thought, because you didn't bring up Miller's study, who was Burgon's student, which shows the opposite conclusion, as I quoted in my last response. Both you and I know that Burgon compiled 86,000 quotations from the Fathers, which are still available at the British Museum that was the basis of Miller's study. Are you suggesting that another study was conducted on those same 86,000 quotations that Miller used in his study, which refuted his study? Dr. Ehrman, I do recognize you as a legitimate scholar in your field of study, and the point I was trying to make in reference to studies is that in this postmodern age, I have found other studies such as Burgon, Miller, Hoskia, Pickering, and others that come to different conclusions.
I'm afraid you're attacking a position that no one holds. If you would like to tell me which books you've read on the topic, I'd be happy to make some suggestions. Do you understand why Miller, Burgon cannot be used anymore, for example?
Let's analyze the opening statement in your last response. For you said, I'm afraid you're attacking a position that no one holds. Whatever do you mean, Dr. Ehrman? Would you have me believe that the New Testament text at Antioch in 385 AD that Chrysostom preached from is basically the same New Testament text with minor scribal variations read in 285 AD in Antioch by Bishop Cyril I, and also basically the same New Testament text with minor scribal variations read in 185 AD in Antioch by Bishop Maximus I, and also basically the same New Testament text with minor scribal variations read in 85 AD in Antioch by Bishop Ignatius the Martyr? It's a yes or no question. If the answer is no, then please tell me which Bishop of Antioch introduced the revised, created, conflated, standardized, or began the text by process, as suggested by Kenyon at the Church of Antioch? As you can see, I listed the historical bishops of Antioch going all the way back to Ignatius in the 1st century for your reference. Now, Dr. Ehrman, as an expert on studies in the field and a teaching professor, please explain the who, when, how, and why it was introduced into the Church of Antioch that Chrysostom read in 385 AD. If you can give a simple and exact answer to those 4 questions, I would be more than happy to give you a donation to your blog.
I mean that the view that there was a thorough redaction of the New Testament text in 4th century Antioch, as evidenced in the writings of Chrysostom, is not, to my knowledge, a view held by any textual critic today. I certainly don't hold that view, and never have. And so I'm asking you to indicate who, based on your reading, does hold to the view. And so I'm asking you to indicate who, based on your reading, does hold to the view so that I can address the issue. So, who does?
Dr. Ehrman, finally we have progress on this matter. So, under your own admission, the text at Antioch in the 4th century, as evidenced in the writing of Chrysostom, was redacted. But the redaction wasn't finalized according to your theory. All I have ever asked is if the text at Antioch in 385 AD that Chrysostom preached from was changed, redacted, revised, conflated, a text influxed, or whatever else you want to call it. So when I asked you in my previous post, is the New Testament text at Antioch in 385 AD that Chrysostom preached from basically the same New Testament text
with minor scribal variations, read in 285 AD in Antioch by Bishop Cyril I, and also basically the same New Testament text with minor scribal variations, read in 185 AD in Antioch by Bishop Maximus I, and was also basically the same New Testament text with minor scribal variations, read in 85 AD in Antioch by Bishop Ignatius the Martyr. The answer, according to your theory, is no. Now, if you're operating under the assertion that the text at Antioch in 385 AD that Chrysostom preached from was redacted, regardless if the process came to fruition, please tell me under which bishop it was introduced into the Church of Antioch before 385 AD, and was not noticed until Griesbach, Hug, and Hort. Now, if I wanted to explore the thoroughness of this so-called redaction of the text at Antioch in 385 AD that Chrysostom preached from, then I would have referred back to Dr. Gordon Fee's citation, who says, these fathers, Chrysostom et al., had an NT only about 90% along the way to a full Byzantine text of the Middle Ages. Dr. Ehrman, 90% seems kinda thorough, don't you agree? Like most of the work has already been done. It's like if I had $100 in my pocket, and I spent 90 of it. There's not that much more that I can buy. Dr. Fee's statement demonstrated that there was a major change to the New Testament text at Antioch in the 4th century that Chrysostom was preaching from, yet still no one noticed until 1400 years after the fact. So Dr. Ehrman, I am asking you again, under which bishop did this so-called non-thorough redacted text was introduced into Antioch? Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Gordon Fee continues his quote with the following statement. Chrysostom's text is still closer to the majority text than it is of any other text of the 2nd or 3rd century. Dr. Ehrman, according to Dr. Fee's theory, not only did Chrysostom's text not exist prior to the 4th century, but Dr. Fee is confining the redaction to the 4th century. So, Dr. Ehrman, what bishop in the 4th century was this not thorough redaction that was 90% Byzantium done under? Was this done under an Arian bishop or a bishop of the Athanasius party at Antioch in the 4th century? Could it have been Eustathius, a bishop at Antioch in 324, and a steadfast opponent of Arianism, who was disposed in 327 AD and banished in 329 AD? Was the introduction of this so-called non-thorough redacted text the real reason why he was disposed? Dr. Ehrman, I also find D.A. Carson's statement quite fascinating. Errors were not added one per generation, generation by generation, but wholesale, as it were. Wow, and still nobody noticed wholesale changes to the New Testament text. Dr. Ehrman, we have already established that the fathers of the apostolic churches noticed minor and major changes to the biblical texts, going from the 2nd century to the 4th century, as I documented earlier in the case of Marcion's shorter text, and Gaius's testimony, and Jerome's Old New Testament translations. Dr. Ehrman, you have even established this point in your study of Origen. Augustine even got into it with the Donatists over Without Cause, and I'm pretty sure you would agree with Augustine on this point, not other points, but for sure this one. Do you see why I find it hard to believe these so-called redaction theories? My faith is still lacking, Dr. Ehrman. Even the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius the Great, debating Asterius, who died in 341 and was an Arian, did not attack his use of the Byzantium text type. Does this not make you wonder, Dr. Ehrman, why Athanasius, who obviously had access to the official text of the Church of Alexandria, being its bishop, didn't seem to find any problem with the text of Asterius? Inquiring minds need to know.
I don't think any bishop introduced the text into Antioch. You don't seem to understand my view. But could you simply answer my question? You are attacking a view that, so far as I know, no one holds. So could you tell me who, in your judgment, holds it? And where, in what book, does this scholar argue it? What I'm trying to say is that you are simply making an argument against a view that doesn't exist, and I don't see the point of that. So please, answer my question. Otherwise, we have no common ground for a discussion. And by the way, there is no doubt about Athanasius's textual affinities, and you have the wrong Asterius.
Allow me a few moments to help clarify for you what positions I am truly challenging yourself and others on that fall within this school of thought. The purpose of this is to give you a better understanding of where I am coming from. First, I am a member of the Anglican Communion and a proud member of the Episcopal Church in USA. The underlying issue that my questions are stemming from is the idea that these so-called earlier texts of the New Testament, i.e. Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, P75, P66, and about 40 or so others, are closer representatives to the texts used by the independent Greek apostolic churches prior to the 4th century, and that these so-called later texts, which are referred to as the textual traditions of the apostolic Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches, are referred to as secondary in origin. Now, when I cast yourself, White, and Wallace in my animations, it is to represent the broad range of theories surrounding this idea, that the texts of the apostolic churches are secondary in origin. Now, I do recognize you as the real legitimate scholar in this group, and the person with the real doctorate degree. Plus, I figured since you were willing to debate Mr. White, I should have an equal, if not better, of a chance for you to accept my invitation to discuss these issues. When I initiated our dialogue, I wanted to begin with discussing the text at Antioch that Chrysostom preached from in 385 AD, because Antioch is the oldest surviving apostolic Greek church, and this is basically the first time in history we can begin to see the official text at Antioch being read to the congregations by a member of the church. Remember, Christianity has just recently become legal, and the Arians have recently been defeated. So the natural assumption is that this text would be basically the same text, barring copyist mistakes and scribal variations, that was received and read by Ignatius of Antioch in 85 AD. Now, you have your particular theories on this so-called creation, for what I term the commonly received text of the apostolic churches, which I am not opposed for you to clarify for me. Hort promoted his conflation theories to explain this so-called creation. Kenyon had his process theories, and Gordon Fee had his theories, D.A. Carson had his, White and Wallace has theirs. One of the major positions I challenge you and others in this camp on, or school of thought, is did this so-called creation really happen? Our discussion thus far has been focused on primarily this issue. Let's be honest, Dr. Ehrman, the Achilles heel of this so-called creation theory is that this camp hasn't been able to demonstrate it, since the theory made its introduction with Hort in 1881. That which you refer to as the Byzantine text is of secondary origin and was historically created. I kind of refer to these theories as the Immaculate Conception theory of the text of Chrysostom, the last 12 verses of Mark, the PA, and many other verses. For Kurt and Barbara Allen, I'm pretty sure you know who they are, Dr. Ehrman, are honest enough to admit that they don't know how it was created. For this is what they are saying when they state, no adequate history has yet been written of the Byzantine text, but this is a task we may well leave to a future generation, or to specialists particularly interested in it today, and consider our own generation fortunate if we can succeed in tracing the history of manuscripts with non-Byzantine texts, and that in its general outlines. J.N. Birdsall isn't saying anything different from the Allens after referring to the work of Lake, Lagrange, Colwell, and Streeter, and actually says it is evident that all presuppositions concerning the Byzantine text or texts, except its inferiority to other types, must be doubted and investigated de novo. Come on, Dr. Ehrman. Birdsall is basically saying these theories have no weight to them, but at the same time saying we are not letting go of our conclusions. What scientist whose hypothesis continues to fail would still maintain the hypothesis? This is what Bergen meant when he said, they assume everything, they prove nothing. So when D.A. Carson says, errors were not added one per generation, generation by generation, but wholesale as it were, I am inclined to ask Karen to please document when these so-called errors were added, and who added them, and what apostolic church texts did they add to, and why didn't anyone notice these wholesale changes that were taking place? Or when Dr. Gordon Fee states, Chrysostom's text is still closer to the majority text than it is to any text of the 2nd or 3rd century. Does Dr. Fee expect us to believe that he has a full New Testament text that was used in the 2nd and 3rd century at the Church of Antioch? Everyone said Chrysostom had great sermons, but no one noticed that his text was different until Griesbach, Hort and Hug, 1400 years after the fact. Dr. Ehrman, you have to admit I have found some pretty interesting quotes. The so-called creation theories are further complicated when we start discussing the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark and the woman in adultery. When Jerome makes the empirical observation that the PA was found in many Greek and Latin manuscripts, you run into the problem of demonstrating how this passage was added into thousands of Greek, Latin, and some Aramaic texts throughout the Mediterranean prior to Jerome's Vulgate. By the way, I do thank you for adding in the footnote to Metzger's book, saying that Didymus of Alexandria appears to quote it. I, on the other hand, can provide independent witness testimony from the ancient world on why the PA was taken out, i.e. Augustine and Nikon. So, Dr. Ehrman, this is where I am coming from.
I think we would have a better conversation if you would keep your posts short and to the point. I asked you which scholars hold the view you're attacking, and you've cited a number of scholars, none of whom have the view you're attacking. That there was a conscientious revision of the text that first appeared in Antioch in the 4th century. I'm not sure if you genuinely don't realize that or not. And it's not clear to me whether you've actually read the books or articles of the scholars you mention. It sounds to me, given the way you mention them, that you've read that they've held the views you summarize. That is, that you've gotten this information by reading what someone else has said about them, instead of reading their scholarship itself. Is that the case? Maybe it would help if you would tell me what you've actually read for yourself, not summaries of what scholars have said, but what scholarship you've actually read. And then I could make some suggestions. If what you're arguing is that the Byzantine text was actually the original form of the text, then we can talk about that, certainly, since it's a view that no bona fide textual critic holds, for massively impressive reasons. And by the way, I don't know if you mean to be insulting, but are you genuinely wondering if I know who Kurt and Barbara Allen are?
Well, help me understand your views, Dr. Ehrman, because I am a little confused. Not only have I read several of your published works and watched many of your debates, but you have written an excellent article titled, "Do Most Manuscripts Have the Original Text?" which is published on your blog that clearly outlines the issues that I have been challenging. Using your article as reference, let me clarify for you what positions I have been challenging you on in my posts. Firstly, I would like to commend this article for truly identifying the key issues in the debate. Here I have listed several points from your article that you identify as the problem. Now, in addressing the problem, you identified that of the thousands of New Testament texts in the Greek that we have available, we have 94% of these manuscripts that are from the 9th century and later. And you also identify a group of fragments and texts that are dated between the 2nd century and the 4th century. After grouping these manuscripts, you state that it's the late medieval manuscripts that cohere together, whereas early manuscripts tend to be different and cohere better with each other than with the later manuscripts. You then ask on a couple of excellent questions. So which manuscripts contain the original text? The 992 majority or the 8 early? That's the problem. If they're earlier, aren't they more likely the original? So Dr. Ehrman, in my previous post, I made the same basic observations when I stated the underlying issue that my questions are stemming from is this idea that these so-called earlier texts of the New Testament, i.e. Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, P75, P66, and about 40 or so others, are closer representatives to the texts used by the independent Greek apostolic churches prior to the 4th century, and that these so-called later texts, which I refer as the textual traditions of the apostolic Greek, Latin churches, are referred to as secondary in origin. In my response above, it's clear that I'm challenging your assertion that the earliest texts are more likely to be the originals. In addition, Dr. Ehrman, in this same article, you raise a question against the majority text position that they still have to explain why the earliest surviving manuscripts have a text different from the majority text. Why does the different text show up early and consistently early rather than consistently later? It is from this statement in your article that I have continually asked why didn't anyone notice that a different text was being introduced into the apostolic churches, when from the 2nd century to the 4th century, changes to the biblical texts were noticed both minor and major. My example, Marcion's text, Gaius' testimony, Jerome's Vulgate, and Lucan's Septuagint. So Dr. Ehrman, when you are asserting that there was a change of the text away from the original, all I have been trying to ask is how was this text created? How did it come into being? Who was involved? And what was the process? When and where did it happen? And why did it take over 1400 years for anyone to notice? I thought as an expert in this field, you could demonstrate the who, what, where, when, why, and how a specific text at Antioch in 385 AD, preached on by Chrysostom, in which the non-thoroughly redacted text in a non-conscious way moved away from the original. This is why I quoted Fee. I did personally read his response to Hodges, who stated Chrysostom text is still closer to the majority text than it is of any text of the 2nd or 3rd century. This is a very simple question that you seem fain to answer, Dr. Ehrman. I also agree that simply because the majority of texts support a common text, it still doesn't mean it's the original, for these earlier texts could have been the majority in their day. But, Dr. Ehrman, you have to be historical as well. The quotes by Alland and Birdsall appear to say they have no idea how the Byzantine text came into being, other than they don't like it. You haven't historically proved that the Apostolic Church's text did change. This is why I challenge you with Jerome's empirical observation that he found the PA in many Greek and Latin manuscripts, to demonstrate the absurdity of these so-called interpolation theories. This is why I used your quote in my introduction to the PA, making the point that even children can realize how silly this sounds. Now, in my videos, I have challenged these so-called earlier texts, Dr. Ehrman, because they are not what you're making them appear to be. You cannot prove that the texts of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus came from the official Greek apostolic churches, because the origins and history of these texts are unknown. Please establish the legal chain of custody for these texts back to any apostolic Greek church in which they were read. You cannot account for the time from their so-called 4th century origin to when Vaticanus was first catalogued at the Vatican, or how Sinaiticus showed up at St. Catherine's. We don't know who authored these texts, or who had access to them. All we know is that these texts were not the type of texts copied by the official Greek churches, especially the Church of Alexandria, which still exists, Dr. Ehrman. Irenaeus, Tertullian, and the apostolic churches used these same lines of arguments against Marcion's text, whose text was earlier, who said his text was the official writings of Paul. Yet Irenaeus and Tertullian documented in their writings the objective criteria for what constituted the original text, demonstrating that the apostolic churches can establish a legal chain of custody for their texts, and that the official churches of Paul basically witness against Marcion's shorter, yet not better text, therefore ruling out Marcion's text. This is the same criteria we use against these apocryphal texts, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, PS 75, PS 66, and others, you assert to be closer representations to the original. Dr. Hill properly identified this as Bergen's true argument.